Thank you very much, Professor Kora. It's a great honor to be the first speaker in your third annual symposium for the Turkish Psychopharmacology Society. I understand how sad a day this is for you, and I can appreciate the loss this is. I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Professor Gupta. What was described in terms of his belief in patient-centered clinical activities, the use of medication, and his devotion to teaching resonate with me. I know very well the excellence of Turkish psychiatry. I will describe in a moment my own experience working with young people from Turkey who have received superb training here and then came to the United States to help me in my work and to learn some research and to come back to Turkey to do for themselves to run their own research programs and to teach. This is my fourth trip to Turkey. I'm happy to say I already know when my fifth trip will be. I'll be back next fall for the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. I also want you to know that my home is covered with Turkish carpets, which I revere, and that my visit to Turkey will probably be a net gain for the Turkish economy, as I undoubtedly will acquire one or two more carpets in the next couple of days. I am going to try to do what was asked of the speakers, to update you about some of the work that's going on, but I am particularly going to do it in a historical context. The history of Clozapine, which we're really honoring today. This is much an honor for Clozapine as it is for me, and I will try to show you what enormous impact it's had on psychopharmacology and is still going to have. I also want to express what you've already heard, my gratitude to a number of pharmaceutical companies who have inspired the work I've done and have financed it. We certainly would not have Clozapine were it not for what is now Novartis and wasn't Sandoz, and I'll tell you a little bit of the history of that during the course of my talk. I wanted to pay particular tribute to these four Turkish psychiatrists, and I don't think any of them are here right now. If they are, raise their hand. We're going to have a reunion tomorrow night, but Professor Yasioglu, Ertuğrul, Akdidi were all in my laboratory and contributed a lot to the research that I'm going to talk about. And Professor, well, not quite yet a professor, but Mehvevi Temuklu and her husband, who's a cardiologist, have helped with some enormously, but I believe, important work we've yet to publish on the issue of the QTC prolongation. And that will be a great story, and it would not have been possible without the year or so that they spent in my laboratory. Well, again, in the historical sense, the dawn of psychopharmacology really involved chlorpromazine. Discovered in Paris in 1950, and in preclinical and clinical work, produced EPS along with its antipsychotic effect in the rodent and human models, and that became known as the typical profile to be expected of an antipsychotic drug. This was the led to the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, and clearly this dominated not only treatment of schizophrenia, but our concepts of what caused the illness and how to approach it. And others would say we haven't really progressed. I dispute that strongly, that we have made progress since chlorpromazine and the typical antipsychotic drugs. And if we have, clozapine is the catalyst for that progress. It was discovered in a search for other antipsychotics in the Vondel laboratories in Bern, Switzerland. In the animal models, they nearly discarded it because it did not produce catalepsy, the rat equivalent of Parkinsonism. And when they could see that it had the typical effect to block amphetamine or the conditioned avoidance response, but not cause catalepsy, they called it an atypical antipsychotic. Paul Janssen claims to be the first person to use the term atypical. It is sometimes referred to as a second generation. That is totally erroneous. There's a recent editorial in Lancet. That is not the editorial. Which didn't say very much that was accurate. Can we? Well, I can speak over it if you can hear it. But they did acknowledge that we should stop using that term. It's inaccurate and has no meaning. When clozapine finally did get into the clinic, and it took many years actually after its discovery, it was found to be an effective antipsychotic at doses in the 150 to 250 milligram per day range, doses which are rarely effective in the treatment-resistant schizophrenic patient. But then as now, clinicians raised the dose beyond the expected range when people didn't respond. They raised the dose until EPS appeared, and when they didn't appear with clozapine, the doses climbed up to a maximum of 900 milligrams a day. So it was this low EPS profile which permitted high dosage, and that's an issue that I'll come back to during this talk. In 1975 in Finland, a cluster of deaths occurred in people taking clozapine. They were very elderly. Epidemiologists came through afterwards to try to understand it, could not definitely relate it to clozapine, but nevertheless, clozapine got the reputation as being an extremely dangerous drug and was immediately withdrawn. There's one very exceptional thing about, one of the many exceptional things about clozapine, is that if you withdraw it rapidly, you're highly likely to induce a very severe psychosis. So severe and so difficult to treat then and now that it led to a demand that clozapine be made available again for those people that had responded to it and couldn't respond to anything else. That saved clozapine. Were it not for that withdrawal psychosis, we almost certainly would not have psychosis. We would not have clozapine. So it was that restoration period that kept it alive, kept people, and I was one of 3 psychiatrists in the United States, Nathan Klein, myself, and John Kane, who were permitted to continue to study clozapine during that period when it was considered too dangerous for general use. Now, some comments on this from the historical sense. There has been no subsequent cluster of deaths or cases of agranulocytosis related to clozapine in that area of Finland or anywhere else in the world, truly suggesting that this was not a clozapine-induced agranulocytosis. Nevertheless, we know that it has a higher rate than other drugs. I've commented on the higher dosage already that was permitted, and because it was the drug of last resort, it could be used for a longer period of time. It had to be used. And that, too, as you'll see from my perspective, is one of the reasons that clozapine is so special, and yet also points to a future where clozapine may not be the only choice for the treatment refractory patient with schizophrenic. A little-known part of the history was that Sandoz tried to find clozapine without agranulocytosis. They came up with the drug fluprolapine. It was used by Jules Angst and others. There was 2 cases of agranulocytosis in the first 300 patients. They dropped it and also discontinued their search for another clozapine. Even though it turned out they were the first to synthesize olanzapine or Zyprexa, but so convinced that they could not separate antipsychotic activity from agranulocytosis in those tricyclic molecules, they dropped olanzapine without patenting it. As I said, were able to continue to use it. I was particularly interested in the neuroendocrine effects at the time. I reported that it did not elevate serum prolactin and was therefore a very weak dopamine receptor blocker. However, in rats, I found it looked just like haloperidol, at least for the first half hour, and showed what I then later showed in the rat brain, that it has the ability to enhance the release of dopamine in different systems in the brain. Most importantly, there were suggestions from its use before it was withdrawn that it did not cause tardive dyskinesia and that it might be able to reverse the effects of tardive dyskinesia. And that was critical to my own involvement with clozapine. Several cases of the most severe tardive dyskinesia I've ever seen, who were also treatment resistant, were sent to my unit in Chicago. I treated the tardive dyskinesia, and to my delight, I also saw the first resolution of psychosis in people who had failed to respond to any other drugs. Of course, tardive dyskinesia develops more frequently because it is dose-related in those people who are refractory. So it was that experience which led the way for me to be able to propose to the FDA at the right time that we study clozapine in treatment-resistant patients. What happened historically is of interest. There was a public outcry in the United States about tardive dyskinesia. Something very important to remind us of now is people push the use of profenazine and typical antipsychotic drugs. And that outcry led to the interest in bringing clozapine back from the dead, so to speak, for those people who had tardive dyskinesia. Sandoz was interested, wanted it approved for tardive dyskinesia, but what happened in the U.S. was the FDA said, no, tardive dyskinesia is not a reason to bring this dangerous drug back. The only people that they would permit to use it were those for whom there was no other way to treat them, the treatment-resistant patient. And it was in the discussions with the FDA that the protocol for Study 30 that Dr. Kane and I devised became the way for clozapine to be tested again in the United States. The FDA didn't believe there was a way to prove it didn't cause tardive dyskinesia, and secondly, they wanted to restrict its use to only those cases who could not respond to any other drug. I'll come back to that in a little later in this talk. So let's see, that's a duplicate of that. So what was the design of the study? We basically had to define treatment resistance, very critical to the talks I'll be giving elsewhere in this Congress. Patients who failed to respond to at least 3 trials then of a typical antipsychotic drug and had moderate to severe positive symptoms and poor social and work function. We then had to show they were treatment resistant by a subsequent trial with haloperidol. It was a huge dose, and if they failed that, then they could be randomized for a 6-week trial of either chlorpromazine up to 800, and it might have even been higher, I forget now, 1,200 or so, and then clozapine up to 900. And we defined response as a 20% improvement in total psychopathology. Historically, I remember going for the interim analysis of those first half of that patient. And to the astonishment of Kane and myself, who were blinded, of course, the statisticians told us that the effect size of clozapine over chlorpromazine was so great that even if in the rest of the trial there was no difference between the two treatments, the effect would still be statistically significant. At that point, clozapine changed my life. I went back to my research group and said, drop everything. We have to understand why clozapine was really able to do that. And these were the bottom line, if you will, of that study. At the end of 6 weeks, 5% or so of the chlorpromazine-treated patients met the criteria for at least 20% improvement and what would be a low to moderate total BPRS score, and 30%, very important, only 30% of the treatment-resistant patients met that. We didn't cure everybody for sure, certainly not at that time. It's interesting to note some people would say chlorpromazine didn't work because the dose was too high or because it was a low potency instead of a medium potency antipsychotic drug. Please don't be taken in by that kind of point of view. We did find that clozapine was superior for both negative and positive symptoms. And interestingly, there was more leukopenia with chlorpromazine. Well, when that paper finally got published in 1988, it was a sensation, I'm pleased to say. This was a cover of Time magazine of one of my patients. That the story was based on a writer spending a week with the patients and the families, and I'll tell you what happened subsequent to that. It was front page news. There were offers to do movies. We would have had a Disney film if Whoopi Goldberg had been willing to play the Afro-American nurse on my unit who was so incredibly important to the recovery of the patients on this. Sandoz was so frightened about clozapine being restored the way Merck should have been, say, about Vioxx, that they instituted a policy of restricted use, no blood monitoring, no drug, that led to the cost of the drug plus monitoring being so high that it led to lawsuits in the United States, severe penalties for Sandoz, which they didn't deserve. But importantly, it set the platform for the price of an antipsychotic drug so enormously high that we now have the case where the atypicals cost the public something like $11 to $12 billion a year. Had clozapine not required that blood monitoring, it would probably be 1/20th of that. That paper of Kane and myself and and others from Sandoz has been cited 2,300 times, probably the major reason why the Archives of General Psychiatry historically is the #1 citation index. It is, I understand, the most cited paper in the history of the Archives of General Psychiatry. But it stimulated a lot more than just those 2,300, that one publication. Here's a slide I put together last night, and you can see the number from PubMed of publications of chlorpromazine, clozapine, haloperidol in green, and then clozapine in red. Between 1965 and the publication of the U.S. close rule study, it was under 400 papers on clozapine in those 24 or 5 years. And since then, that's gone up to over 5,000 more publications. Now, these are the clinical studies. I'll talk about the basic rate, a 14-fold increase, and they're still pouring out. There's still so much to be learned about this drug, and you can see that haloperidol is still going strong. So the archetypal basic and clinical study is some version comparing clozapine with haloperidol, or now it's probably going to be perfenazine. Well, I continued to treat the people in study 30 afterwards, and to my pleasure and delight, I discovered that after 6 weeks, there was still further improvement to be gained. In fact, a lot more improvement. In our hands, and I'll show you a replication of this, actually Jeff Lieberman published the same thing within a year of my publication, that another 30% responded between 6 weeks and 6 months, but nothing thereafter. But the time between 6 weeks and 6 months reflects something different in the mechanism of action of clozapine, because you don't see this kind of delayed response to the same extent in typical antipsychotic drugs. In fact, I think that group is a different subtype of schizophrenia. I'll show you something to that extent. And it may reflect a different mechanism of action. Instead of the usual blockade of dopamine receptors, and as I'll talk about the blockade of serotonin receptors that are critical for atypical antipsychotic drugs in my view, I believe there's a very important story of neuroplasticity that emerges during that delayed time. And we're very much in the middle of human and animal studies that get at changes in the synaptic nerve endings, changes in neurogenesis. And in fact, I mentioned Professor Ertuğrul from Hacettepe, who just got her PhD this week on long-term effects of clozapine on brain growth factor, BDNF. As I've said, I am the view, I don't know what David Osser, who's going to talk later, is going to say about it, that clozapine does treat negative symptoms more effectively than typical neuroleptic drugs. Here are some data showing that to demonstrate this, in our view, one needs to study patients with high negative symptoms. And whether they have high positive or high negative, they don't have to be deficit state. We have found an effect that is independent of improvement in positive symptoms or EPS changes. And I mention this in particular because part of the history of at least psychiatry and psychopharmacology in America is a long-running dispute between myself and Professor Will Carpenter. No matter what I ever write, he automatically writes the opposite. And it's not as a personal level. Of course, it's based on our science, but it is a curiosity. It has more than just a personal significance, however. Carpenter is of the view, for example, you cannot study negative symptom change. You cannot study cognitive improvement if another component of schizophrenia is changing at the same time. It's a view I dispute. I've disputed clinically. I disputed on the basis of mechanism of action. And I believe there are valid statistical ways to control for the changes in those other dimensions. But it'll be interesting, perhaps, if you share some of your experiences on that. This is an example of how we adjusted for the changes in positive symptoms with clozapine and still found that there was an improvement in negative symptoms over 6 weeks and 6 months. Again, it too can be delayed. Okay. Now, one thing that people didn't appreciate, and I think if they did, we might have been spared some of the problems that emerged in the Katie study, which I'll talk about a little bit. And that is that immediately after finishing the study in treatment-resistant patients, I asked for and received funding from Sandoz to study it in non-treatment resistant patients, in first and second episode patients who had relapsed either because they stopped their medication or because of the cycles of psychosis that occur in the early stages of the illness. And we compared it in a flexible dose design with low-dose haloperidol. Even then I was aware that the dose of haloperidol should essentially be around 5 to 10 milligrams a day or even less. So we randomized a group of these excellent responders to typical antipsychotic drugs. Because you cannot blind clozapine very well, we videotaped all the interviews, so all the raters were blinded. And importantly, we already were studying the cognition effects, the cognitive effects of clozapine at that time. And the results were as follows. We published that there was no advantage to clozapine over haloperidol. So think of that, in the treatment of positive symptoms or total psychopathology in that. So the idea of the CATIE study that there might be an advantage for risperidone or olanzapine or quetiapine was really counter to my view, published view, that even clozapine had any advantages over that drug. We did, in fact, though, there was one advantage in that light. We did find that the time to discontinuation of haloperidol in that study was much less than the time to discontinuation of clozapine. But I never did, and still don't, consider that a very useful endpoint. This is the BPRS total there. Again, we also found no difference in the global assessment of function, quality of life, and even no difference in EPS because the dose of haloperidol was so low. What we did find, however, was highly significant advantages for clozapine over haloperidol in cognition. And I'll go into that a little bit more. And this was a 2-year study, and these advantages for cognition were maintained over the 2-year period. We did not find any changes over baseline. We didn't see any significant practice effect. All controversial conclusions at that time, but conclusions that I still believe in strongly. And that improvement in cognition was critical, as I'll tell you, in terms of the history of schizophrenia research at this time. Because for me, and then as I wrote about it in various publications, I challenged the view that treatment of positive symptoms was the be-all and end-all of our strategies for treating schizophrenia. Now, one of the crucial observations of that study was the dosage. Again, we could have gone up to the same dose range we use in the typical treatment-resistant patients, but we found it wasn't necessary. The average dose in the non-treatment-resistant patients was a little bit more than half of that in the treatment-resistant patients. The plasma levels that we found necessary to treat treatment-resistant were much lower in the non-treatment-resistant patients. And we didn't find that 6 week to 6 month effect in the non-treatment-resistant patients. So now I've taken the story up until the mid-90s, about 5 or 6 years after, and by that point I was really focusing on clozapine and cognition and clozapine and suicide. As you said, we didn't see any, and nor did anybody else at the time, see any advantages for cognition of the typical antipsychotic drugs. And this paper, Hager et al. 93, was the first paper in the modern era showing that any antipsychotic drug could improve cognition. And this is the 6-week data. The data are presented in terms of standard deviations below normal. At baseline, these treatment-resistant patients are about 2 standard deviations below normal. This is verbal fluency, particularly severe deficit in working memory. This is a crucial finding, which is again held up, that working memory is worsened by clozapine. That was the one thing that worsened. And we didn't find any significant effects at 6 weeks in long-term memory and in executive function. However, by 6 months, and again, we get now out of the range so much of just neurotransmitter effects. I'm not saying they're important, but maybe into this neuroplasticity. And very few of the trials go on that long. You can see that we now have a much more robust improvement in verbal fluency, in speeded motor pursuit, in long-term hippocampal memory, and in some tests of executive function. Now, these were not huge effects, but they were important enough. I stood by them. I was challenged vigorously by Dan Weinberger and Terry Goldberg, and was still challenged by Carpenter and others, and the Katie study. Time will tell what is the true story here, but I'll show you in some of this why I think, and others, many others share with me, the view that this is a real effect. So this is a summary of 20 studies on the column 1 here by Harvey and Keefe, summarizing data in terms of effect size. A 0.3 improvement is a real effect, or is considered clinically observable small effect. And the rank order of the particular dimensions of cognition were exactly as I reported 3 or 4 years ago. Our group summarized the next 20 studies, found the same results. I've commented on this. This controversy led to the Matrix program, which I have basically not been involved with because my views differ from the mainstream there. They differ from the Katie study. But interestingly, there's a vast amount of animal literature using every technique you could imagine, showing differences between the typicals and atypicals, mostly clozapine, but right across the board with olanzapine and the other, showing that these drugs improve animal models of cognition and have effects on neuroplasticity that the typical drugs don't. So those that believe that the typicals are no different in cognition, if they're correct, they challenge an enormous amount of neuroscience. Now, what happened historically about clozapine and suicide is that we were seeing almost no readmissions for suicidality once we had people stabilized on clozapine for a few months. I had the good fortune of a Palestinian woman, Gadiro Keeley, to help me review our case records. We did a mirror image study, and to our great surprise, or confirmation, I shouldn't call it great surprise, of our clinical observations, we found an 85% decrease in the number of suicide attempts in ordinary schizophrenic patients, not selected for a history of suicide. This was over a 2-year period. There were numbers of studies confirming that from registry studies, but to really nail it, and here Sandoz came to the rescue, I proposed a study excuse me, which they eventually funded to get it registered as a drug to improve suicide. This is the famous Intercept study in which clozapine beat olanzapine, and it had historically even more importance, namely that this broke the FDA lock view that you couldn't get an approval of a drug for a indication other than psychosis. This led to the possibility of getting drugs improved for cognition. Daniel Vasella, who was the president of Novartis, was an incredible champion of that study. He was told not to go ahead with it by his colleagues at Novartis, but he said it was too important not to do when the cost went from $10 to $40 million. Interestingly, and this data will be published very shortly, I'm not sure where, comes from Finland. They have done a 5-year review of all deaths due to suicide in the schizophrenic population in Finland, and they found that the people on clozapine had the lowest suicide rate of all, even though by history they had the highest attempt rate. They also found that clozapine, and this is a big surprise, had the lowest rate of death due to cardiovascular disease of all the atypicals, of all antipsychotic drugs. And they have called for that drug to be a first-line treatment for schizophrenia on the basis of this life-saving effects of clozapine. And I'm interesting to see the repercussions of that. Well, clozapine has become much more important even than just schizophrenia. It's used in treatment-resistant bipolar disorder, may have some benefit to reduce substance abuse. It's the first effective treatment, tolerable treatment for L-dopa psychosis, and on and on. So we truly should be honoring this drug as we are tonight. Well, I've talked about the clinical, and let me tell you a little bit about the basic. It took a long time to appreciate that clozapine was truly novel. Saul Snyder and Phil Seaman thought it could be reconciled with the dopamine hypothesis. If you knew its D2 affinity, that was sufficient. I challenged that view in a letter to Science, and Saul Snyder began referring to me as Dr. Clozapine. I accept that mantle. It's something I feel honored by. As I told you, when I went back to my laboratory after the interim study, we began to study its mechanism of action. We had at least, you see here, 10, 12 effects of clozapine that might be considered, but we zeroed in on the idea that its strong 5-HT2A and weak D2 antagonism was the essence of atypicality, at least in terms of low EPS. You see that 5-HT2A D2 ratio, it's been called the Meltzer ratio in a number of papers. Here in the slide from Brian Roth, with the ratio in the clozapine in the atypical drugs over here being dramatically different, whereas the typical drugs, and chlorpromazine would be a good example, their 5-HT2A and D2 affinities are quite comparable. So it's the difference between these two, and I'll show you that in important. Well, what happened to the story of clozapine following the publication in 1989? You can see in the red again, that the basic papers went up from about, again, around 400 now to 2,000, about a 4 or 5-fold increase. Tremendous decline in the studies of chlorpromazine, and again, haloperidol is hanging in there, around 5,000 or 6,000. Okay. Well, that 5-HT2D2 theory led, in fact, to the discovery and development of most of the drugs we're using, drugs that are still beginning to appear, Sertindol, and others down here that I don't have time. But we now are faced with what I think is a lot of erroneous effectiveness research from the Cady and the Cutlass studies that have challenged the differences between these drugs. And if there's time, I'm quite prepared to defend the atypical drugs. Dr. Osser is probably going to talk more about some of the clinical fine points, so I'll just mention that I still believe that when you have a patient with prolonged psychosis who doesn't respond well enough to clozapine, that one should add ECT, that various kinds of add-on therapies have basically proved ineffective. There's a lot of interest in lamotrigine right now, but I'm going to tell you a little bit to do honor to some of my students on this edition of risperidone. I call it a Turkish tale. So when Elif left our laboratory and went back to Turkey, I encouraged her to initiate this study of adding risperidone, low-dose risperidone or placebo in a randomized blinded study to partial responders to clozapine. She had Dr. Kverchik and also Dr. Ertugrul to help her, and we published this paper. This was the study, again, a small scale, but a randomized double-blind trial, 6 weeks in duration. We didn't have the funding for a 6-month study. I doubt the results would have been different. All the clinical work, as you see, was here in Turkey. And what we found was no difference. Well, I shouldn't say that. We did find a difference between the addition of the placebo or risperidone. The placebo group improved more than the risperidone group in both total psychopathology and slightly and positive symptoms, no real difference in negative symptoms. I considered the advantage to the placebo being that it wasn't causing any more dopamine D2 receptor blockade. This is just some more of that. There have been a number of studies since then. Most of them are in agreement with this study, including one in the New England Journal of Medicine. Let me close with this story. This is part of what we're currently working on now with clozapine. My original study, 30 patients and a number of others, have continued to take clozapine in Cleveland. I'm no longer there, but I've gone back to study the genetics of response to clozapine, and also along the way what happened to these people after prolonged treatment. Now remember, these are treatment-resistant patients. They were quite sick to begin with. This is data on about the first 50 of the people in that group. And this is the good news first. This is the BPRS total score, probably corresponding to a PANSS score of 70 or 80. And you can see at 6 months there was highly significant improvement. Didn't get any much better in the group as a whole at 6 months. But now there's about a 9-year gap between the last contact, sometimes it's 12 or 13 years, and their current ratings, and they're a lot better, okay? The total BPRS score has gone down. Their positive symptom scores have gone down significantly. Same pattern as I've just described. Their negative symptoms are not looking that good, however. What's happened? Again, we had improvement, as I've said earlier on, but now they're back to baseline. Okay. When we looked at global assessment of function, however, these people have improved. There's a dissociation now between the negative symptoms, and you'll see in a big one coming, and cognition. What happened with the components of clozapine or of cognition where clozapine improved? Controlled word association or verbal fluency, significant improvement, pretty much maintained, but now they lost it. Now, I don't know, because I don't have a concurrent control group, that this isn't just the effect of aging. But let me tell you, it gets worse. This is immediate recall, improvement, and then it falls off the cliff so that their hippocampal function and memory is now worse. The neuropsychologist, PhD, who did this testing was trained by the neuropsychologist who did the original testing. And I'm quite sure that this is a reliable change. What she also noticed, and as the data came through, she was appalled, really, that their executive function, the number of categories in the Wisconsin card sort, was really deteriorated. So what's going on here? We don't know. I don't understand the process. I'd say this is consistent with the Kraepelinian view of clozapine, schizophrenia as a dementia with a long-term poor prognosis. Would things have been better had they not been on clozapine? Would they have been worse if they'd been on another drug? I don't know. It certainly highlights again that we're right to be focusing on cognition as a major target of new drug therapy. So in conclusion, and this is obviously just a very superficial survey of thousands, 10,000 patient papers, basic and clinical now on clozapine. It may be the second most important psychotropic drug after clozapine, after chlorpromazine. Why do I say that? It established the concept of treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and what we're going forward in the future is doing some very intensive genetic studies of the treatment-resistant versus the non-treatment. I'll talk about some of those later today, or on tomorrow rather. Establishing a typicality concept with enormous scientific, commercial, and societal impact. The last word has not been said on this issue yet. See if it's as positive as I think it was. Clozapine inspired tremendous interest again on negative symptoms, on suicide and cognition, with enormous benefits to some patients, as you could see from the Finnish study. It inspired a great deal of brain imaging and genetics research, which I didn't have time to go into. And it inspired vast amounts of basic research, including the thesis of Aygan Ertuğrul here in Turkey, to understand its advantages, if there are real advantages. And nobody disputes the advantages for treatment-resistant patients, although, as I'll show today, I think I can achieve the same thing with other atypical antipsychotic drugs. And it certainly catalyzed the development of novel targets. This is particularly coming out of the genetic work with clozapine, where people do so-called expression arrays after chronic treatment of clozapine and find any number of genes. I'm working with a colleague, Brian Roth, where we have knocked out various genes in mice, and we have been able to block the effects of clozapine. These are truly novel genes, although interestingly, I can tell you this much about it, many of them are critical to parts of the serotonin pathway. The serotonin pathway is for sure very essential to clozapine. So let me close on that. I hope I've stayed close to my time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you for the honor of opening this meeting.